And now for the story's conclusion, Chapter 10. The bruised sky above Wendell rolled like something alive, the heavy clouds pregnant with ice. When they finally burst, the hailstones spilled forth in a single biblical tumult that scattered the 20,000 downtown and sent them screaming for shelter. Several paraders were knocked unconscious by the larger hailstones, and two were blinded when they looked up in fear at the angry sky. Hailstones pelted sidewalks and shattered street lamps, ricocheting through storefront windows. The crepe paper floats were battered to wet pulp. Scraps of costume were left in sodden heaps by the fleeing paraders. In the outlying neighborhoods, those few residents of Wendell not in attendance at the King Frost Parade downtown emerged in confusion on doorsteps and lawns beneath a brilliantly clear night sky and listened to the faraway screams, commingled with the otherworldly chorus of 1,000 blaring alarms. Racing across campus with headlights extinguished, Art found himself in a sudden skid as the hailstorm started. What the? He fought to regain control of the patrol car as it fishtailed, back wheels spinning on the hail-riddled asphalt. Hailstones big as chestnuts drummed off the roof and dimpled the hood. A dozen starbursts freckled the windshield. The patrol car went into a spin and did a complete 360 in the intersection of Montgomery and Old Winthrop. In one of those magically cooperative moments between fate and physics, the patrol car came out of its spin and to a final stop pointing westbound on Old Winthrop, precisely where Art had been headed in the first place. He gave a nervous hiccup of laughter and stamped on the accelerator. 1 hour until this was over, which meant only one more hour until the witch finished draining Abby dry. 1 hour left for Art to try to find the little girl and wake her from the nightmare she'd been living. As he drove, he remembered the day he'd first stumbled across Abby in the woods, sleeping sweetly on the grave like some spellbound fairy tale princess. It was back to these woods that he was now driving, recklessly and with only a vague sense of a plan, back to the place where this had all began for him. He had no idea if he would find Abby held captive there, but he knew the gravesite in the woods had been her special place, and perhaps it held some sentimentality as well for the witches, their intended graves. Their first victim had been snatched nearby. Wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that the newly awoken witches, still sluggish from their long dormancy, wouldn't venture far from their first feedings? But how did you kill a witch? She wasn't like any of the other monsters out of folklore, defeatable with silver bullets or crucifixes. In fairy tales, Hansel and Gretel say she was vanquished by guile, lured into her own oven by the ingenious siblings. Art doubted if guile would work against one of the creatures he'd met earlier that evening, so he was hanging his hopes on the deputy's pump-action shotgun he'd found in the trunk and carried now in the passenger seat. He wouldn't get to use it. Suddenly, another patrol car roared out from a cross street and broadsided Art. He had a split-second's glimpse of the sheriff behind the wheel, and then he was slammed sideways and sent spinning. The patrol car slammed into the utility pole. Art's consciousness blinked out with the collision. Some uncertain amount of time later, he awoke to the sound of a car horn blaring a single, unmodulated wail. He couldn't see anything. The world outside the car was obscured by spiderwebs of shattered safety glass. He raised the back of his hand to his lip, and it came away bloody. The driver's side door was suddenly wrenched open, and Art was hauled out unceremoniously. He heard the menacing chunk of a pump-action shotgun chambering rounds. He winced, rolled over onto his back in the sandy grit of the roadside. The sheriff stood over him and said with deadly calm, "On your belly. Hands behind your head." Art was stunned, hurting. "Do it," the sheriff said, and jabbed the shotgun at him. Art obeyed. The sheriff straddled him, twisting first one and then the other hand around painfully behind his back. Once handcuffed, Art was jerked roughly to his feet and thrown against the sheriff's car, which had survived the collision with only a crumpled grill and one shattered headlight. "I didn't kill him," Art said, having trouble breathing. His ribs hurt. The deputy. "I didn't." "Shut up," the sheriff said. He returned to the open driver's side of the door of his patrol car and talked quietly into the radio. Art could just make out Nottingham's words to his lone remaining deputy. Ran into him, literally. I spotted him fleeing in Reed's patrol car. Art leaned back against the car and looked up at the menacing sky. The clouds that writhed like a canopy over downtown Wendell were spreading now, passing overhead in a kind of meteorological race for all horizons. They devoured the stars and screened out the moonlight. Art heard the sheriff say, "I'm bringing him in." Then the crunch of the sheriff's boots on the roadside gravel. "Come on," he said, and gripped Art's arm hard. He maneuvered him in through the back door of his car, careful to keep Art from banging his head on the frame. The back of the patrol car was fitted with hard plastic bucket seats with a deep well to accommodate handcuffed fists. "Bill, listen to me," Art began once the sheriff had climbed behind the steering wheel. "We don't have much time. The little girl, Abby, there's still a chance we can save her." The sheriff ignored Art. He slipped the car into gear, executed a U-turn in the middle of Old Winthrop Road. "Bill, please!" Nothing. A brick wall. Art slumped in the back seat. No time for this. Then an idea. He leaned forward, speaking through the perforated plexiglass separating them. "I'll take you to her right now," Art said, then steeled himself for the lie. "I'll take you where I'm hiding her." The sheriff didn't turn, but his foot eased on the accelerator. Debating, Art upped the ante. "She's still alive. You can still save her." The sheriff stood on the brake, and Art was thrown face first into the plexiglass. He bounced back against the bucket seat, his nose streaming blood. The sheriff turned around to glare at Art, calling his bluff. "Show me." Ten minutes later, they were tramping through the woods. Art in the lead with the flashlight, the sheriff following with the shotgun. The trees had shed their leaves during the previous week, and now dead leaves crunched underfoot as the two men walked in single file. Art played the flashlight's tight beam over the deer path they were following. His heart was hammering high in his chest, and his mouth was dry. His mind raced through scenarios of what he'd say once they arrived at the gravesite and found it empty. "How much farther?" the sheriff said. "It's just up ahead," Art lied. Nothing looked familiar, and he wondered if he'd gotten lost. It had been weeks since he'd last navigated these woods successfully, and back then he'd had the advantage of daylight. They tramped on, their footsteps hypnotic. Art saw a clearing ahead, but when they arrived at it, there were no gravestones and no little girl. Art slowed and felt the shotgun barrel butt him between the shoulder blades. "Where is she?" Nottingham asked. "Not yet," Art said, trying to invest his response with a confidence he didn't feel. He took up his forced march again, resuming with it his old appeal to reason. "Please, Bill, you've known me for 25 years. Do you really think I could have done that to your deputy? Or the little girl's father? Do I really look like that kind of monster to you?" The sheriff said, "If you don't show me where the little girl is in the next 5 minutes, you won't leave these woods alive." Art turned suddenly to face him, the shotgun resting lightly against his sternum. "If we find her, neither of us will." He saw the sheriff frown in confusion. He said, "I'm telling you, Bill, turn around, go back to your patrol car, and go home to your family. Because if we find Abby, the thing that killed her father and killed your deputy and has killed God knows how many other people in this fucking town over the last 3 centuries is going to be there guarding her." The sheriff looked at Art strangely then, though it might have been a trick of the shadows thrown by the flashlight. For a moment it seemed like he might be considering Art's words. Then he poked Art with the gun barrel, uttering his one-word refrain. "Where?" Art sighed, turned, and resumed his march. Ahead, something resolved out of the darkness, a great ramshackle outline behind the screen of trees. Art felt his scrotum tighten, a primal reaction to something sensed just below the level of conscious perception, a smell, a subliminal sound. A barn, standing alone in a clearing in the middle of dense woods. A barn that seemed to hold contained within its rotting a barn that seemed to hold contained within its rotting boards a darkness deeper than the night's. He lifted a hand and pointed at the barn, and gave the sheriff his answer. "There." As the ER house staff welcomed the hailstorm's first walking wounded, Karen was being transported from her private room to the hospital's new childbirth wellness center. Annexed to the west wing of Wendell General, the Wellness Center had been built the preceding year according to a more enlightened paradigm of childbirth, eschewing the chilly tiled delivery rooms of yore for the kinder pastel schemes of birthing environments. The facility was state of the art and even boasted a large heated tub into whose gently circulating waters Essex County's more adventurous mothers could expel their progeny. The idea being that the transition from womb to water exposed the newborn to a lesser shock. And yet, despite the center's soothing murals and discreet natural lighting provided by skylights in each suite, technology was never far from sight, and at a moment's notice any room in the center could be converted into a fully equipped surgical unit. Karen was wheeled into Birthing Suite D. The room was decorated in a simple abstract print wallpaper, was scented lightly with something artificially floral, and lighted at a more muted wattage than elsewhere in the hospital. There was nary a stainless steel instrument to be seen. From somewhere unseen overhead, they were piping in light jazz, a sax solo so chastely inoffensive it would never grace a love scene. Maybe that was the idea, to subliminally snuff out any conflicting stimuli below the waist. And yet, despite the center's best efforts at concealment, Karen noticed in one corner of the suite a crash cart, complete with shock paddles and defibrillator, and over there, behind a scrim of surgical drape, wasn't that an anesthesiologist's ventilator? Suddenly another contraction seized her, and Karen was wrenched away from any interest in her surroundings. "Breathe through the pain," she heard one of the RNs say. "No pushing yet." "Fuck you, no pushing," she wanted to say, but she kept quiet, focusing her energy on the task of clamping down on this pain. Her breath hissed through clenched teeth. Around her, the RN was busying herself like a scrub-clad chambermaid, humming along with the light jazz. The contraction subsided, and Karen tipped her head back into the damp pillow. Maria appeared at the bedside, wearing surgical scrubs. "Not much longer now," the obstetrician said, glancing at the wall clock. "The pain will be over before midnight." She fed Karen ice chips from her hand. Karen tasted latex from Maria's gloves. Another contraction coming. Less than a minute apart now. She tipped her head back and saw the ceiling overhead, painted to look like a sunny afternoon sky, complete with airbrushed clouds. It would have been a more complete illusion if not for the skylight amid the clouds, like a dark hole punched through the midday sky. It was the biggest magic circle Wendy had ever drawn, big enough to accommodate her gremlin within its circumference. She had parked on the shoulder of the back road more than 100 feet from the covered trestle bridge that had serviced the Wendell textile mill once upon a time. The place where Wither had attacked and captured Jack Carter. The place where she first appeared, Wendy thought. I suppose it's only appropriate that it end here. Silently, she began laying out her magical implements. Frankie watched as Wendy poured flour through a paper funnel, fiddling with the disposable camera she had insisted they stop for at a convenience store on the way to the mill road. "I want proof," she had said adamantly. "No one's going to believe this shit without some hard evidence." Now she was a bundle of nerves. When the flash went off in her face, she nearly dropped the camera. Satisfied with the camera's operation, she slipped it into the pocket of her jean jacket. She rubbed her arms to ward off a chill that had less to do with cold than fear. Wendy had watched her confidence dwindle the closer they came to the covered trestle bridge. As Wendy laid out the bowl of rice, the cup of wine, the burner, and the incense, Frankie asked, "What if it doesn't work?" Since Frankie had placed her life at risk by staying at her side, Wendy had felt an obligation to tell her about the strange things that had happened at each ceremony she had performed. "You mean, what if I can't summon Wither? What if I can't banish her?" Frankie nodded. "Some of my spells worked, since the nightmares began. Wither opened some sort of mental circuit between us. She's been siphoning energy from my soul. Jesus," Wendy shuddered, "this is creeping me out. But she's also opened a flow of magic from her to me. That must be why the spells worked. Maybe she found me amusing, her little witch in training, while she sucked me dry. Maybe I can overload that circuit, create a feedback loop powerful enough to finish her off once and for all." "If she's been draining you from afar," Frankie said, still coming to grips with the idea that the witch, rather than The monster, which had apparently been a flesh and blood witch 300 years ago, was sucking the life energy right out of her friend's body. What's to stop her from finishing the job without getting her hands dirty? You have to understand, when she touches my mind, I touch hers. I'd be lying if I said I understood how she thinks, but I've had a taste, and that qualifies me more than anyone. I don't think she can resist the challenge. She's the leader of the coven. She has a chip on her shoulder. She has something to prove. Next problem, Frankie said, with the quirk of a nervous smile. What if it does work? What do you mean? Well, if I'm down with these magic rules and regulations, this circle is supposed to protect us, right? Wendy nodded. Well, what if she shows up? Hell, what if the whole coven shows up, and it turns out they don't give a fuck about the rules of magic circles and pentagrams and whatnot? Frankie stopped herself abruptly, realizing how shrill she sounded. I mean, hypothetically speaking. Then I'll use this, Wendy said, and withdrew one of her father's hunting rifles from her bulky duffel bag. I hope we don't need it, but if you see me go for the rifle, you'll know we're screwed. That's comforting, Frankie said with caustic irony. Wendy tossed the rifle through the open car window to the passenger seat where it would be easy to retrieve. Running away isn't an option anymore. Wendy looked at her. I have to do this, not just for myself, but for Karen and her baby, and for that little girl, Abby. Wendy looked meaningfully at Frankie. You could still go. Maybe you're not on the hit list. Take the car. Come back for me after midnight. Maybe all of this will have been a bad dream. Frankie seemed to stand straighter, shook her head decisively. I could never live with myself if I left you alone here, no matter what happens. I understand, Wendy said softly, secretly grateful she wouldn't be alone for the witching hour. She wrote swiftly on a piece of parchment paper. What's that? Frankie asked, obviously trying to distract herself in the details. If you're in a foreign country, it helps to speak the language, she said, narrating the process. Wendy raised her arms demonstratingly within the circle. This is the language they speak. Frankie nodded. She fiddled with her camera again as she sat on the hood of the gremlin, glancing up as Wendy donned the white linen robe and sat facing the incense holder at the east compass point of the circle. Do you usually perform magic with your car in the circle? Frankie asked. Wendy's closed eyes snapped open as the question broke her concentration. Oh, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. I'm breaking some rules, Wendy said. I obviously can't compete on her level. If I want to win, you have to cheat? If she played by the rules, she would have been dead 300 years ago, Wendy said, then returned to her meditation. Frankie was silent. Wendy's hand trembled as she drank her chamomile mixture, but she was having trouble centering herself, focusing her thoughts. Many lives were at stake. The Tektite vanishing stone was in a pouch around her neck, beside her crystal and a Nice sachet. Tonight she'd brought a ceremonial dagger with her. She had purchased the dagger in the early days of her fascination with witchcraft, though she'd never had the courage to cut herself with it. That, too, had changed. She stood over the parchment paper, dagger held in her right hand. With a quick jab, she pricked her thumb and let drops of blood fall to the paper. The pain came a moment later, but when it arrived, it was surprisingly fierce, a stinging that throbbed in time with her heartbeat. The drops of blood blotted out parts of the charcoal writing, but she could still read the spell. She read it to herself 3 times. Wither, Cole, and Hutchins, I banish thee. These lives are not yours, so set them free. Abandon forever what you intend. The damage you've caused may begin to mend. She picked up the paper and set it afire with a wood stove match, watched the smoke drift heavenward. She held the parchment over the burner with one trembling hand, recalling the way the fire had leapt up her arm last night. God, has it only been one night? In her other hand she clutched the Tektite stone. She repeated the spell 3 times aloud, feeling more foolish with each repetition. The words were instantly consumed by the night, drifting up and away like the thin candle smoke, devoured by the hungry moon. From the center of town, dark storm clouds rolled across the sky, blotting out the stars one by one. Wendy was left feeling small, ridiculously young, a little girl with useless nursery rhymes. Like whistling in the dark to scare away the evil spirits, she thought. Amazingly, the cut on her thumb had already closed, the wound healing as quickly as the deep wounds in her leg had. She might be getting older, but she was healing much faster. She slipped the dagger into the side pocket of her robe. The pocket hung down slightly where the thread had unraveled, but that was the least of her worries. She joined Frankie and waited, then waited some more. Nothing. "What now?" Frankie asked after a long silence. "We could take off our clothes and dance naked counterclockwise. You're not serious?" "I'm not making this stuff up," Wendy said with a nervous laugh. She jumped off the hood of the Gremlin and moved the duffel bag in front of the grill. She glanced at her watch. 11:27. "Shit," she said. "I've had enough of this waiting." "We're leaving?" Frankie said, in relief in her voice. "Not yet," Wendy said, and stepped outside the circle. "If I'm right, my clock runs out in about 30 minutes. Doesn't matter where I go." Wendy, I thought you said it was a real bad idea to leave the circle." "I did. Stay put." "But you're—" "Breaking my own rules again," Wendy said, and nodded. If the circle really afforded her protection, maybe it was keeping Wither away. Maybe the only way to lure Wither to this place was by exposing herself outside the circle. She walked toward the dark bridge. It was a link to a dead past, a hulking anachronism, as much as out of place in the late 20th century as witches and ghosts and things that go bump in the night. Perhaps she should have made her circle on top of the bridge, where Jack had stood the first time Wither had appeared. She shuddered. Much too vulnerable up there. "Wendy, don't even think about climbing up there," Frankie said, almost reading her mind. "Don't worry, I won't make it that easy for her," Wendy replied. Wither might not be able to resist an encore performance of her infamous bridge snatching. Wendy walked closer to the gaping mouth of the bridge. She looked down the embankment at an old oak's exposed roots. The tree seemed as if it wanted to escape, was prying itself out of the ground one tortured root at a time. Wendy stepped into the dark passage of the bridge and tried to feel some connection to the witch. Her appearance here had coincided with Wendy's first ceremony. She should feel some lingering. The hair on the nape of her neck rose. Wendy felt a slow vibration building up under her feet. "Oh my God," she said. "What?" "I feel something." "Wendy, get out of there." "Right," Wendy said, realizing her tactical error. She promptly stepped out from the maw of the bridge, and the sensation was gone. Damn, she thought, her challenge to Wither had begun to work, but it was probably just her overactive imagination playing tricks on her. Wendy clenched her teeth in anger, making her jaw ache. Her fists curled into tight little balls that caused her mutated fingernails to bite painfully into her palms. Suddenly her rage was so bright and crimson it scared her. She was near the breaking point and felt utterly helpless. She wanted to scream her frustration. It wasn't fair that Wither should be able to wring the life out of her without showing her face here in the last few minutes of Wendy's life. More than anything, Wendy wanted to tell the bitch to go to hell. "Wither!" she called, yelling so loud that her voice crackled. "Elizabeth Wither! I know who you are. I know what you are. I know you've been playing with me, using me." She wheeled around, directed her voice to another part of the sky. "You were a gutless killer 300 years ago, and that's all you are now. Show your ugly fucking face and let's get this over with." "Wendy, you're scaring me," Frankie called from within the circle. "Don't be afraid," Wendy said to her, shouting theatrically as she stared into the starry silent sky. "She's not worth it. Wither and her coven are cowards, preying on the innocent, hiding themselves. They're afraid. Come down and face me, you sorry-ass, sickening bitch." She waited, closed her eyes and listened. Imagined the sight of this huge circle seen from above, fires burning at the compass points, a hypothetically bright mage in her mind's eye. Nothing. Waiting. Finally, Wendy threw down her hands, her voice in shreds. Walking toward Frankie, she croaked, "Sorry I wasted your time." "Look on the bright side," Frankie offered. "Maybe your spell worked and you really have banished her. Maybe they're all gone." Wendy stepped into the circle, reached for her duffel bag. "We can only hope," she said. "What's that god-awful smell?" "Oh, God! Oh, Jesus!" Frankie cried, scrambling down off the hood of the Gremlin. Wendy turned in time to see Elizabeth Wither coming screaming down from the night like a dark meteor. She struck the roof of the bridge and it exploded into a million flying splinters and boards. Wendy gagged, thinking of this thing crawling around in her mind for months, using her, feeding off of her. "Don't leave the circle," she whispered to Frankie. "Take the keys." I'm not leaving without you. Just be ready to get us out of here, Wendy yelled. Get in the car, just in case. Wendy walked to the edge of the circle. Her legs were so weak she worried they might buckle at any moment. Elizabeth Wither, she called as the cloud of dust from the ruined bridge began to settle. As she feared, she had only succeeded in getting Wither's attention, not the two other witches. But Wither was the leader of the coven, so maybe that was good enough to end this. The witch appeared from the ruin, clambering over the leaning mass of timber. She leapt to the ground with a gravity-defying grace and covered the distance from the bridge to Wendy in a few strides, stopping abruptly just outside of the circle. The ancient witch cocked her head to the side as she studied the line drawn with flour, the way a dog will as it considers something curious. The blast from the bridge had distracted the continuous line, blotting it out in several places, breaking it. The witch chuckled hoarsely, a rumbling bass sound that made Wendy's stomach buoyant. It was a sound full of death. With the circle broken, all Wendy had left was pure bravado. Get the fuck out of my life, she shouted from her side of the circle. I performed the spell. I banish you and your coven. The chuckling stopped. You'd better start the car, Wendy called back to Frankie. The witch took a long, slow step over the circle's perimeter, growling. Wendy heard the gremlin's engine cranking behind her. Suddenly it turned over, and Wendy spun around. The witch lunged, shrieking. Frankie leaned out the driver's side window and snapped a picture. The flashbulb bleached the night bright white for one instant, and the witch paused, shrieking again, this time painfully, her eyes squeezed shut. Wendy knew instinctively the witch hated bright daylight, and what was the camera flash but a modern-day spell of localized daylight? Wendy swung the car door open, grabbed the rifle off the seat, and turned to face Wither. The witch whipped her large head around as if trying to pick up a scent or shake off the after-image of the flash. She seemed to stare at the gremlin for a moment, then lumbered forward. The gremlin's engine sputtered and stalled. Frankie began slamming her hands against the steering wheel. Your spells aren't working, she yelled, cranking the ignition again. This might, Wendy said, leveling her father's hunting rifle at the witch. Elizabeth Wither, I banish you, she said as she squeezed the trigger. The rifle leapt in her arms. The bullet ripped into Wither's stomach, exposing tender red skin underneath the black hide. Still, the witch stepped forward. Wendy worked the rifle's action, fired again. A black splash, and a bright raw blossom opened on the witch's throat. Then came the blood, spraying Wendy's arm, so hot it burnt her. She hastily wiped it on her jeans. The witch punched the claws of her one hand right through the gremlin's roof. Wendy smelled the witch's blood, the sharp tang of her own fear, and the witch's rancid hide. She also smelled gasoline. The gremlin's engine was flooded. The sheriff shoved Art out from the stand of trees into the clearing, saying, Take me to her. Art glared at him. Quietly, he warned, and then pantomimed that they should approach with stealth, keeping low. Then he dashed across the open, weedy space between the woods and the rotting wooden structure. The sheriff followed a few paces behind. Together they crouched against the side of the barn. Jesus, what's that smell? The sheriff whispered. He'd grown up in farm country, had visited morgues and crime scenes, so he'd known the worst kind of stenches rendered by the living and the dead. This was neither, a ripe, fetid reek that seemed to coat the back of his throat. He shook out a handkerchief and pressed it to his nose. It stinks to high. Art raised a hand to silence him. He gestured, and the sheriff turned to see movement, a figure emerging from the trees at the opposite side of the clearing from which they had come. As the figure neared, they saw it was an old man carrying a kerosene lantern in one hand and a double-barreled shotgun in the other. His features in the play of yellow lamplight were flat, dead, as if whittled out of wood. Without hesitating, the old man hauled open a door of the barn and entered. Art said quietly, Must be their caretaker. Whose caretaker? The sheriff asked. Art fixed him with a pitying look. He was about to find out. Through the skylight, Karen saw an apron of cloud envelop the moon. Okay, honey, we'll give this a try the old-fashioned way, Maria Labajo said, peeking up from beneath the sterile drapes that tinted Karen's legs in the stirrups. The baby's presenting feet first. I'm going to try to reposition her." The obstetrician turned to the RN assisting her and said, "Page anesthesia. If we can't manage a vaginal birth in the next 15 minutes, I'm doing a C-section." The RN ducked out of the room. Karen looked at the big cheerful clock on the wall and made a mental note of Maria's deadline. It was now 11:45. Maria turned back to Karen, said, "Now you can push." Karen gasped in relief, gathering what little reserves of strength were left in her after the nearly 24-hour labor, and pushed. The room shuddered as something heavy landed overhead. The lights flickered. Doctor and patient looked up simultaneously. The sky exploded. Glass showered down on them in jagged splinters from the shattered skylight. Maria screamed, trying to shield her patient with her own body. Karen looked up and saw a monstrous face leering down at her. Maria saw the look of shock and horror on her patient's face and followed her gaze up to the skylight. Despite her Western training, the Filipino obstetrician had been raised in a culture with a healthy respect for the supernatural, and when she saw the feral thing leering down at them through the hole in the painted sky, she recognized it as a creature out of a nightmare. The witch reached down with one long arm and swept Maria aside like a rag doll. Maria hit the wall and collapsed in a heap. Karen rolled off the bed just as the witch's claw came thudding down, shredding surgical drapes and mattress. Karen cowered beneath the bed as the witch's grasping claw knocked over the IV stand and scattering sterile instruments. Suddenly Karen doubled in pain as her insides clenched around another contraction. Simultaneously, the witch's furious attack ceased. Karen peeked out from her hiding place below the bed and saw the witch bent double as well, making a strange warbling moan, as if in sympathetic agony. Karen took advantage of the monster's momentary distraction to crawl across to where Maria lay. She pressed her fingers to her friend's throat until she found the pulse. The contraction was subsiding. Overhead, Karen heard the warbling turn to a shuddering growl. She looked up, and the thing that had once been Rebecca Cole let out a roar. Art said, "The little girl is inside the barn. I know it." The sheriff listened gravely, checked his shotgun, glanced up at the menacing clouds as a farmer might before making a decision about his crops. "We'll wait till the old man comes out. I don't want any shots fired in the dark if that little girl's inside." "Okay, but—" Blam! The plank wall between them splintered outward as buckshot ripped through the rotten wood. Art fell back, his ear ringing from the blast, and saw the sheriff roll across the weeds and come up in a crouch. Blam! A second shotgun blast widened the exit wound created by the first. The sheriff didn't return fire, unwilling to risk a random shot into the dark where a child was hidden. He crouched, waiting for the shotgun held high. Waited until the old man materialized from the shadows and peered out through the hole he'd blasted in the barn wall. Then the sheriff swung around in a single lethal arc, smashing the butt of the shotgun into the ancient face. The old man's leer split into a ragged cleft, the fissure of nose and lips. He dropped his shotgun and raised his hands to his ruined teeth. With a gravelly curse, he lunged at the sheriff through the hole in the barn wall. But the sheriff was ready. He stepped clear and swung the shotgun in an uppercut that snapped the old man's head back and sent him staggering across the weeds. Only now did the sheriff level the business end of the shotgun at the old man. "Stop right there! Don't move!" In the cloud-smothered moonlight, the old man's bloodied grin looked black, like a hole punched in a rotten tree. He shambled forward. "I said, fucking move!" Or I said, "Don't fucking move!" The old man kept coming. The sheriff fired into his chest. At this close range, the sound was deafening. The old man was staggered, but remained standing. His shirt was shredded by the blast. The blood that came from the dozen fresh entrance wounds flowed sluggishly. The old man kept coming. Some trick of the moonlight transformed his bloody mouth to a leer. "Stop!" the sheriff said, and when he didn't, fired another blast. This one stopped the old man less than a yard away from the sheriff. But still he didn't fall, only lowered his head as if in prayer and let out a long sigh. He took another shambling step, this time shorter in stride. Blam! A final blast, fired from point-blank range. The old man's hand closed gently around the barrel of the sheriff's gun, not to wrench it away from the younger man, but rather simply to steady himself. the way an old widower might pause in midnight relief along the journey from bathroom back to bed with his hand upon the doorknob. The two men, old and young, stood connected by the shotgun for several long heartbeats, the old man's eyes downcast, the young man's disbelieving. The old man was dead long before the sheriff gave him the nudge that toppled him. Wendy shoved the rifle into Wither's jaws and pulled the trigger. Black mess exploded out the back of the witch's long head, and Wendy felt a distant pain echo in the back of her own head. Far from fatal, the wound seemed only an annoyance to the witch, and the stomach wound was already beginning to heal. Wither whipped her head from side to side, tearing the rifle from Wendy's grasp, crushing the stock and flinging it aside. Wendy jumped in the car, slammed her door shut. Now would be a good time to get out of here. From where she sat hunched over the steering wheel, Frankie gave Wendy a brief panicked look, and she desperately twisted the ignition key. She pounded the dashboard. When the engine finally spurted to hesitant life, she was so startled she almost forgot to put it in gear. She stomped the accelerator repeatedly as if she were keeping time to some weird song of destruction, coaxing the sputtering engine into a roar. The gremlin leapt away. Wendy looked back out the hatchback window, saw nothing. Where the hell is she? Then she remembered the witch could fly. Jesus, Frankie said. Wendy looked out the windshield just as Frankie swerved the car, narrowly avoiding the witch's descent. She almost drove past Elizabeth Wither, but glass shattered as the back of the gremlin dipped like an overbalanced seesaw. Both rear tires blew out with twin deafening concussions. Wendy looked back at the black leathery arm that had driven through the wide hatchback window like a railroad spike through a china plate. Frankie floored the accelerator, but the gremlin only swerved side to side, metal squealing in protest. It's pinned, Wendy said, amazed at the brute strength of the witch. If she lets go, even for a second, I'll drive on the fucking rims. But Wendy knew they wouldn't be able to outrun the witch, even if the gremlin still had rear tires. Maybe noise, Wendy said. Try the horn. The sound of metal and cloth tearing was almost completely muffled by the shrill of horn. But Wendy felt the car tremble, smelled a blast of foul air, and looked up as clawed hands peeled back the roof of the gremlin in a single jagged strip. Wendy's own fingernails throbbed in sympathy. When the dark hand reached for another ragged section of metal, Wendy pushed off the seat and raked her nails into the witch's exposed skin, gouging deep furrows. The witch howled, either startled or in pain, and snapped back her oversized hand. We'll have to run for it, Wendy said. Head for the trees, anywhere she can't fly. Here goes, Frankie said, and pushed her door. She pushed again with a grunt of effort. Shit, it's stuck. The battered roof had crimped the metal doorframe. Wendy tried her door, managed to shove it open with a protesting squeal of metal. This side, she called. Give me your hand. Wendy edged around the door, pulling Frankie by her arm. Hurry! But Frankie's feet got tangled up, and her disposable camera fell out of her jacket. She scooped it up, pushed off against the edge of the door, and started to run, but was spun around forcefully. She looked back, saw the witch's ruptured face, dripping black blood and gore as it leered down at her, an unnatural hunger in her eyes. The clawed fingers of her long-reaching arm had snagged Frankie's jacket. The witch tried to haul Frankie into the air, but her claws ripped through the fabric of the jacket, and Frankie fell hard, bruising her ribs. Wendy pulled her to her feet as the witch tugged her other arm free of the debris in the back of the hatchback. Black blood speckled the length of that arm as well as the one Wendy had clawed. Maybe if she loses enough blood, she'll pass out. Come on, Wendy shouted. With a quick nod, Frankie scooped up the camera and raced down the hill with her. They veered toward the tree line, but Frankie's chest burned with the effort of the run as her lungs strained her sore ribs. Her stomach became dangerously queasy. Wendy slowed to help her. She looked back in time to see the witch lift the gremlin onto its side and roll it down the embankment. The crumpling sound of metal was punctuated by the loud cracks of trees snapping until the car slammed into the trunk of a red maple. Wendy noticed the camera in Frankie's hands. Is the flash still good? Think so, Frankie said. It's the only spell that worked tonight, Wendy said. Keep it ready. Quick, into the trees. Wendy glanced back, but the witch was already floating down from among the trees right in front of them. Hurry, she screamed, almost losing her balance as she pulled up short. The flash! Smile! Frankie yelled insanely and took out another picture as the witch swooped low, ragged cloth fluttering behind her. The flashbulb made a short popping sound as it lit the night. Wither shrieked, lost her bearings, and toppled from the sky, crashing into the trees on the rising embankment. As the witch struggled to her feet, eyes staring without focusing, Wendy and Frankie veered around her. Wendy staggered, strangely blind as well. As the phosphorus green supernova faded from her retina, she saw two young girls running downwind of her, running from her. A moment's disorientation, and she realized she was one of those girls. Her mind had overlapped with the witch's when the flash disoriented her. The line between them seemed to blur. It had to be very close to midnight. Time was running out. Are you okay? Frankie asked, her arm on Wendy's as she stumbled around, confused. Run! Wendy yelled, too late. With Frankie hobbled and Wendy blinded, they had barely made it across the road to the tree line. The witch was loping toward them, reaching out with long clawed hands. She struck down a sapling with a sound like a rifle shot. Wendy ducked under the sweeping arm, but Frankie's reflexes were slower, diminished even more by her bruised ribs. The camera fell and Wither was quick to stomp on the cardboard and plastic contraption, pulverizing it. Frankie screamed as the witch hoisted her into the air and shook her like a rag doll. Frankie! The blonde girl flailed at the witch, but Wither hardly noticed the blows. Run! Frankie shouted to Wendy through gritted teeth, her eyes wide with fear, brimming with tears. Get the hell out of here! The witch shook the girl again, viciously, and Wendy suddenly felt her friend's weight in her own arms, tiny and insubstantial. Wendy felt a sickening hunger for her friend's flesh, and a deeper hunger, a hunger ripe with ecstasy and power. Instead of trying to screen out the witch's sensation, Wendy drew on it, opened herself to the connection, and in that moment felt herself gain enough control of Wither's limbs to force the witch to drop Frankie. Wither looked over at Wendy and roared in indignation at being so easily manipulated. Wendy fought to screen out the connection between them, but couldn't react in time to prevent the tidal rush of pure demonic rage. The witch glanced down at Frankie's helpless form, the power to snuff out her life in a heartbeat all too clear in the disparity of their sizes. Wendy had to distract the witch, get her away from Frankie once and for all. Here, Wither, I'm here, Wendy called. You want me? I'm right here. The towering witch took a step in her direction. Wendy backed away, luring the witch away from her friend. Glancing back a moment later, she saw she wasn't being pursued. The witch stood over Frankie, was reaching down, her mouth opening wide to expose long yellow teeth, thick strands of bloody saliva. No, right here. Here, damn it. The witch towered over Frankie, who was too petrified to even crawl away from her. You want me, remember? Wendy screamed. I'm your fucking battery. And with those words, she opened the circuit wide. Wither turned to Wendy. Dizzying flood of sensation, her vision split in two, this hideous bullet-scarred body superimposed within the outlines of an 18-year-old girl, like the shape beneath the shadow, the woman this monster had once been, this young girl about to become a monster. She felt a great petrified strength within her young limbs and a swooning freedom from the pull of gravity. She imagined Wither's inky poison within her own veins pulling her down to a warm place where she could breathe water or soil as she slept in silent darkness, where she could listen only to stones and the heartbeat of the earth itself. She let herself go, and it was as effortless, this consumption, as rest, easy as two open palms, simple as sheep. Wither had begun to feed. Karen had just managed to drag herself to the exit of Birthing Suite D when she suddenly doubled over again, racked by another fierce contraction. From the skylight overhead, she heard the witch bellow in sympathetic agony. The pain was so intense this time she almost blacked out. She clutched her abdomen. The witch, trapped in the narrow frame of the skylight, reached out to Karen in a gesture that seemed almost imploring. As the black claw opened like some spiky desert bloom before her, Karen felt the baby lurch violently. She heard the witch's curious warbling, saw the raven eyes fixed on her abdomen, and understood finally that it was her baby the witch wanted. "No," Karen said, and crossed one arm protectively across her middle. The witch hissed, lips curling back from 100 glistening teeth. Karen pulled herself up into a crouch, steadying herself against the dizzying rush of blood to her head. She staggered, supporting herself against the wall. Overhead, bits of ceiling plaster were falling. The walls shuddered as the witch thrashed. She scanned in desperation for a weapon. Nothing. Only hospital equipment, heart monitor, ventilating machine, oxygen tanks, defibrillator. She grabbed the crash cart, wheeled it around, began tugging open its drawers, looking for anything sharp. As she scattered the useless contents of each drawer, her eye fell on the canary yellow defibrillator unit. Printed along with the instructions on top was a warning. Danger. Explosion hazard if used near flammable anesthesia or concentrated oxygen. The shock paddles had fallen off the top of the unit and dangled at the end of their long cords. Karen turned, scanning the room, finally spotting what she was searching for, the oxygen tanks attached to the ventilator. She hurried, doubled over, cradling her stomach with one hand, to the nearest tank and cranked open the valve. She could feel the tight little funnel of pure oxygen on her face. She tipped the tank onto its side and rolled it, hissing, to the crash cart. Overhead, the witch slipped a shoulder through the widening hole in the sky. Karen focused on her work, entwining the shock paddles around the hissing oxygen valve. Another contraction, so fierce it dropped her to her knees. She crawled toward the door, sat down against it, and used her body weight to tip it open backward. Maria was crawling toward her now, and Karen helped push her out of the birthing suite and into the hallway. Karen grabbed the rolling crash cart and pushed it out through the door, trailing its shock paddle leads. The leads weren't very long, only a few feet, and they stretched taut now where they wrapped around the doorframe. Karen felt her strength fading. The room seemed darker now. The bright blue flame of fury she'd felt only moments before was dwindling, but she had to finish this thing that had taken Paul from her and was trying now to take her baby. She crawled out through the open door and heard the door to birthing suite D close behind her. With a sudden crash, the witch came plummeting down in a shower of debris. Karen cranked the voltage knob on the defibrillator all the way to the right, 360 joules. She looked in through the window. Rebecca Cole was standing in the middle of the room, looking back at her. The witch hissed, took a lunging step forward. Karen pressed the two red buttons on the defibrillator simultaneously, discharging the electric shock. A flash, a rush of igniting oxygen. Karen was blown backward against the corridor wall by the white-hot flash. The last thing she remembered before the blackness closed over her was the shrieking wail of the witch in flames. Art and the sheriff entered the barn. They saw the old man's shotgun lying in the straw beside the kerosene lantern. Art carried the flashlight, though its beam seemed outmatched by the seething darkness. Far overhead was just visible a ragged hole in the roof, through which they could see the silent drift of moonlight cloud. "Abby?" Art called into the shadows, his voice high and trembling. "Abby, can you hear me?" He panned the flashlight beam across the hayloft, the support beams hewn from rough wood. The sheriff walked farther into the dark, craning his head back to peer up into the rafters. He thought he could make out something up there, a knot of deeper blackness. "Over here," the sheriff called. Art joined him. The sheriff pointed, and Art shone the flashlight toward the high ceiling. "There!" The flashlight's beam found the little girl suspended from the rafters, trussed like a spider's prey. Her eyes were open, staring down at them, bright in the flashlight beam. She wasn't moving, and for a moment Art thought they were too late. But then she squirmed and turned her eyes from the painful light. "She's alive," Art said. The sheriff pushed him aside and called up to the little girl. "We'll get you down, honey." The sheriff began climbing the ladder to the hayloft, still holding his shotgun. Art waited on the ground. Once in the hayloft, the sheriff stepped out onto one of the rafters and began edging out carefully across the open. When he reached the little girl, she cried out and tried to squirm away from him, but he talked to her soothingly, humming a favorite Raffi song of his own 6-year-old daughter. The little girl quieted. The sheriff laid aside his shotgun on the rafter and took out a clasp knife. He sawed at the tarry scraps of cloth that bound her. Art watched from below. Behind the bandana, his eye throbbed with his racing pulse. "Hurry!" he called up to them. Where was the witch? He scanned the dark corners of the barn, alert to any movement. Why had she abandoned her prize? Up on the rafter, the sheriff swore to himself as the sticky goo gummed his knife's edge. He scraped the black mess off of the rafter and resumed sawing at the terry cloth. Finally, the little girl dropped into his arms. She hugged him around the neck instinctively. "Hold on real tight, sweetheart," he told her, and kissed the blonde crown of her head. With the little girl cradled in one arm and the shotgun in the other, he began edging back along the rafter toward the hayloft. When he reached it, he lifted the little girl off of him and dropped her gently into the waiting hay. Art stood at the base of the ladder and beckoned her down to him. "Just a little farther now, Abby." The child hesitated at the top of the ladder, giving Art a dark look. "She's afraid of you," the sheriff said. "It's okay, Abby," Art called to her, trying not to allow his own panic to frighten her. "I won't hurt you." She looked back at the sheriff a few feet above her, as if for permission. He nodded toward Art and said to the little girl, "It's okay, sweetheart. Just climb down to him." She extended a dainty bare foot to the top rung and began her slow descent. By the fourth rung she was within Archer's reach, and he lifted her clear of the ladder and hugged her, saying over and over again, "I've got you now. It's okay. I've got you." She clung to him, and he felt tears well up in his eyes, sharp and stinging. He called to the sheriff, "You'd better hurry and climb down from there." He stopped, alert. He heard the little girl draw a sharp breath beside his ear and felt her pulse quicken. Abby said, "She's back." She was staring up into the rafters at the far side of the barn. Movement overhead, sudden and violent, the shadows coming alive. Art spun, trying to fix it with the flashlight beam, but the witch was moving too fast. The flashlight bulb imploded with a quiet pop. Art dropped it to the hay underfoot. "Bill, get down from there." Too late. They heard a startled cry as the sheriff was snatched from the hayloft and carried aloft high into the rafters. Blam! 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 3 deafening shotgun blasts exploded in quick succession, each strobing nightmarish shadows. The witch shrieked and dropped the sheriff. He fell across the 20-foot open barn and landed hard on the hard-packed dirt floor. Art ran to him and saw a splinter of bloody bone jutting from his thigh. The barn shuddered around them as the witch leapt from the rafter to the next overhead. Art tried to track her movement through the dark, but without the flashlight it was impossible. He set Abby down and began dragging the groaning sheriff toward the barn door. Abby held onto Art's pant leg, whimpering. Art tripped over something in the hay underfoot and looked down, the old man's double-barreled shotgun. He broke it open, saw 2 fresh shells inside. The witch had already survived 3 blasts at close range. He'd have to make these last two count. Where is she? He could see nothing. The only remaining light was cast by the old kerosene lamp resting on the floor a few yards away. The wick had burned down to a dim blue flame, as if the darkness itself was smothering it. "Where are you, Sarah Hutchins?" Art thought, hefting the shotgun. He shouted up into the rafters, "I know you're up there, Sarah." At the sound of her name, the witch hissed from a high corner. Art immediately trained the twin gun barrels in that direction of the sound. "You've overstayed your welcome," Art shouted up to the witch. "There's a grave waiting for you, Sarah." And now came a new sound, echoing from a dozen directions at once, impossible to pinpoint. Laughter. A deep, little liquid rattle. Art felt his stomach clench at the distinctly human sound and was reminded that his enemy was not some brute animal who could be easily provoked, but a malevolent intelligence with an equally malevolent patience. She was waiting. Then suddenly she was in motion. He heard the shuddering thud of her moving from one rafter to the next, tried to track her across the dark. The movement stopped, and as the echoes rippled away, the silence returned like a still and impenetrable surface. The witch could be anywhere now. She was playing with them, enjoying her advantage over them in the dark. Beside him, Abby whimpered. Art picked her up, and she buried her face in his shoulder, crying. She wrapped her arms around his neck, accidentally brushing his bandana awry. And the darkness became suddenly visible. His injured right eye saw through the shadows. The darkness deepened into a textured landscape of surface and shadow. Suddenly, what had been a blanket of darkness became a terrain of varied nightshades, blues and grays and violets. He saw the barn's complex framework of rafters and supports, saw the ancient hayloft in exquisite detail, saw the old rusted baling hooks dangling by the chains high above them. She was on the ground with them, only a few yards away, crouched beneath the hayloft, watching them, motionless as a cat, thinking she remained unseen in the dark, and that she alone had the advantage of night sight. But the witch was wrong. She herself was indirectly responsible for the gift of this night-adapted eye. Art let her think he couldn't see her crouching there, yards away. He fought the impulse to turn and fire at her. He could wait as well. He watched her rise slowly, silently from her crouch and stride toward them. Closer. Come closer, Sarah. She stood within 3 yards of them. Sarah, he called up into the empty rafters as if he thought she was still hiding there. He saw her lips curl back in a snarling smile, pleased with herself, playing with them. He spun and emptied the first barrel into her. The blast knocked her back a step, roaring in surprise. Furious, she lunged at them. 1 shell left. Art didn't aim at her this time, though, but at a different target, the kerosene lamp. The blast sprayed flaming kerosene against the witch, setting her tattered rags aflame. The fire spread to the hay beneath her. She bellowed in agony. Art threw aside the shotgun. One arm cradling Abby, he grabbed the sheriff by the scruff of his jacket and dragged him toward the barn door. Behind them, the witch screamed from within the liquid flame that engulfed her. She staggered, thrashing, trying to beat out the flames, and collided with one of the barn's support beams. The old barn shifted and groaned, collapsing in on itself. Even as the flames rushed across dried straw to the 4 crumbling walls of the dilapidated barn, Art dragged the sheriff clear, then collapsed beside him outside in the witchgrass. Abby sat in Art's lap and stared up at the fire with solemn eyes. Together, the 3 refugees of the blaze watched the biggest bonfire any of them had ever seen send hissing embers spiraling up to the midnight sky. Now that it was too late, Wendy finally understood. Wither's presence mingled in the confines of Wendy's body and mind, acquainting her with Wendy in the most intimate way possible. Wither hadn't been draining away Wendy's life, seasoning her maybe, weakening her soul possibly, preparing her body for a demonic transfer of life's energy, a soul, definitely. But she'd had it completely backward. The witch needed to replace Wendy's life and soul with her own. There were cycles within cycles, waking every 100 years to feed, to grow, to change, but every 300 years the hardened, monstrous body had to be replaced, sloughed off to start a new cycle when the ancient life fitted itself to the confines of a fresh young body, to start another 300-year cycle of growth in Wendy's body. Wendy wandered helplessly in her mind. Her memories, her soul, would be cast in the discarded, weakened carcass of the witch, a useless husk that would quickly shrivel and die. Or would the witch consume that which was Wendy, her essence, in the process of taking residence in her flesh? And would anyone, even her family, know that a being of pure evil now wore her skin like a suit of clothes? The process had weakened Wendy's will. She felt herself winking out, her consciousness like a flickering fluorescent light bulb. Each flicker was longer than the last. Wither's mind raged within her, testing the body, the reflexes, rooting in the corners of her mind, stirring up lost memories and blotting them up, filling them with her own, and revealing herself to Wendy. Wither no longer saw Wendy as a threat or an obstacle. She was making herself at home in a young woman's mind, a mind that Wendy was surrendering to an ancient evil force. Wendy felt diminished, losing herself, but seeing Wither for what she was at long last. Another time, over 300 years ago, a carriage ride. Elizabeth Wither, the woman who was Elizabeth Wither, returning to London. It is night, and the coach careens wildly as the horses scream. The coachman's scream follows, but it is all too brief. Charles Wither pats her hand in comfort, but his eyes widen in terror. A black arm, impossibly long, bursts through the carriage door, plunges into his chest, and pulls him into the night. He is dead before he can scream. The arm comes again, but this time slowly, lifting Elizabeth gently through the shattered side of the carriage into the night for an embrace that Wendy has finally come to understand. Other times, other faces, other women in endless 300-year cycles. Wendy looks back in time through the inverted telescope of Wither's predatory mind. In Wither's mind, Wendy sees the fall and rise of Rome. She sees the first trilithon of Stonehenge raised on Salisbury Plain, a monument that will require more than 1,500 years to construct. She sees the moon god's zigzag of Ur in Samaria. She sees the collapse of science into superstition, technology into barbarism, cities into huts, the countless faces of a line of women stretching back to the belief in pagan gods and demons. And if the gods have proved false, the demons are all too real. And Wither, or that which has become known as Wither, has been there all along, hiding in the shadows, just beyond the light and warmth of the first campfires, preying on humankind. She could not be understood by any one religion because she has outlasted them all. She has always been there, feeding. Frankie watched horrified as Elizabeth Wither held Wendy in a bizarre lover's embrace, her nearly hairless black head poised inches from Wendy's face, their mouths parted, as if in anticipation of some unholy kiss between woman and demon. From the witch's mouth came a long, guttural, clotted sigh, and the air between them rippled like heat waves, but Frankie knew it was something else moving between them, some vital energy. Wendy had said Wither was draining her life force like a battery, but it looked to Frankie as if the transfer was moving in the opposite direction. Wendy seemed to vibrate with energy, while the 9-foot-tall monster that held her in its grip appeared to be diminished with each passing moment. Wendy's eyes had rolled back in their sockets, her head lolling from side to side in a weakened struggle, even as her limbs trembled with nervous energy. Slowly, Frankie was coming to a horrible realization, but the progression of her thought was interrupted as the ceremonial dagger fell from the frayed pocket of Wendy's robe. Frankie saw the flash of metal. The blade struck haft first, fell with the point facing her. No magic in the dagger, Frankie now realized. She had reserved a small corner of faith for Wendy's magic, circles, and banishments, had believed Wendy might somehow be able to protect them from the real witch, hell, a coven of them. But Frankie's belief had crumbled as each gesture and incantation had proved empty and useless against the witch's evil. But a knife was a knife, magic or not. Frankie crawled forward, reached for the dagger, then winced at the sharp pain in her side. She clutched the dagger within her intertwined fingers, both hands trembling violently. She raised it above the knotty span of the witch's clawed foot, then slammed the point of the dagger down. In a last fading moment of coherent thought, Wendy understands she is just the latest victim, one more sacrificial host to Wither, in a line stretching back over 5,000 years. Wither is a plague on mankind, and an abomination to nature, which she has always had the ability to pervert in the service of her evil. She is a malevolent force that has never been denied. All thoughts of resistance slip through Wendy's ability to concentrate. She is almost gone. A shaft of pain lanced through the darkness. As Wendy's eyes fluttered open, the witch drew her head back. Wendy felt an echo pain in her own foot, and the more immediate agony of the witch's crushing grip on her arms. A smothering evil of despair had been lifted from Wendy's mind, providing an instant of clarity. She had snapped back from the brink of oblivion. The witch had been suppressing Wendy's ability to resist, her ability to even consider the possibility of resisting, by making her believe, truly believe, her situation was hopeless. The reprieve might be short-lived. Wendy didn't hesitate. She reached for Elizabeth Wither's gnarled face and plunged her thumbs with their mutated nails deep into the witch's bulging yellow eyes. The witch screamed, dropping Wendy as both clawed hands reached for her own damaged face. Wendy fell to the ground, momentarily blind as well, rolling quickly out from under the witch's stomping feet. She heard the witch bellowing in pain, the heavy thudding blows of her feet as her long arms lashed about in their blind search for her prey. Wendy focused on her own identity to seek her sense of self, independent of Wither. Herself. Her family, her friends, her profs, her classes, her stupid gremlin, but more deeply, her hopes and dreams, her happiness at what she and Alex had shared, followed by her grief and guilt over what had happened to Alex. She climbed to her feet. "Quiet!" she shouted to Frankie. Her vision began to clear. She searched for a piece of deadwood, found a branch Wither herself had broken from a maple tree, and began to swing it back and forth, thwacking it against the trees, the dead leaves at her feet, until finally Wither followed the sound. Wendy ran through the trees at full speed and burst onto the cracked blacktop of the condemned Wendell Textile Mills parking lot. Raging and blind, Wither swatted trees from her path and followed Wendy's noisy retreat, the witch's loping strides quickly closing the distance. Wendy's immediate goal was to lure Wither as far from Frankie as possible. Beyond that, she only wanted to stay out of that fateful embrace. She felt as if she'd been given a death row pardon, and she would rather kill herself than let the evil of Winthrop creep into her mind again, to devour or discard her soul as she took up residence in Wendy's body. Nowhere to hide, but inside the long, sprawling building. The nearest door was hanging from one rusty hinge. Wendy slipped through the opening with a squeal of protest from the door, then into the shadowy darkness of the condemned mill. Most of the windows, high and low, had been shattered over the years by bored teenagers throwing rocks. The machinery of the mill had been removed long ago, along with copper tubing and anything else of even marginal value. By the time Wendy had surveyed her enclosed surroundings, the door screeched as Wither slammed into it, ripping it off its one remaining hinge. The walls of the building seemed to quake with the impact. Dust rained down on Wendy's head, along with several chips of plaster. The witch hurled the metal door into the building and smashed her way through the door frame after it. Wendy could hear a low, keening moan in the building, decayed metal straining to hold its form as the witch battered against the walls. Wendy worried the place would come down on her head any second. Suddenly it dawned on her. She'd read that a pile of stones had crushed an accused Salem witch or a wizard in an attempt to exact a confession. And right this moment, Wendy was fresh out of bullets, stakes, or fire. She looked around quickly. How to bring down the house, collapse a building, even a condemned one? She had seen the implosions of demolished buildings on the news all the time, but that involved the strategic placement of explosive. Think, she told herself. How? Now that Wither was inside the building and not pounding against the doorframe anymore, the vibrations had begun to subside. The imminent danger of collapse had passed, unless she could help the process along by knocking out a load-bearing wall. She remembered their old house, before they'd moved to the president's mansion in Danfield, how her mother had wanted to knock down a wall between two small rooms to make one medium-sized room. The contractor told her the wall had to stay because it was a load-bearing wall, supporting the weight of the upper floor. Wendy realized that the second floor row of offices was held up by the line of four plastered columns, probably with a girder of steel at their core. She walked carefully behind the first one and rapped on it with her branch. Bits of lath fell from the crumbling column. Wendy just hoped the process of entropy, nature's most unrelying force, had sufficient time to work its decaying magic. Wither came charging at the raging sound, like a bull spotting the toreador's cape. The witch seemed to loom incredibly larger with every loping stride. At the last moment, Wendy dodged toward the second column. Wither hit the first with the force of a locomotive. Lath exploded in a cloud of debris, and the steel underneath was dislodged from its mooring. Incredibly, Wither wrenched the girder even farther out of position. The creak and moan of steel above Wendy's head became a discordant song, punctuated by the crack of splitting plaster and crumpling cinder blocks. She would die, but she would take Wither with her. The second column had already begun to buckle. Wendy swatted it with her branch. "Over here!" she shouted. Black blood oozed from Wither's gaping eye sockets. She bared her teeth and charged, lowering her head as she reached for the sound of Wendy's voice. But Wendy had sidestepped, and the second column crumbled under the witch's onslaught. The witch grinned through broken teeth, pleased with this intimidating demonstration of power, that ramming herself into human constructions wasn't hurting her at all, probably thinking to demoralize Wendy. The groaning above became more pronounced, and the far end of the row of offices seemed to lean downward. Popping, crunching sounds rang out above. Wendy didn't think she'd need to have Wither charge the remaining two columns. Just keep her under here. Chips of stone and dust began to rain down on them. "Over here," Wendy whispered. Wither slowed, as if warned by Wendy's cautious tone, perhaps thinking there might be a hole in the floor before her. The witch's feet lifted off the ground, and she moved forward, floating, her head just inches below the crumbling ceiling. The third column was bending, twisting, lath popping and spraying as the tortured metal underneath slowly gave way under the pressure from above. Wendy backed away, the sounds of her cross-trainers crunching bits of debris now drowned out by the sudden escalating roar above her. Wither was still unaware the ceiling was about to come down on both of them, and Wendy was looking for a corner to hide in when she realized the window behind her was broken, a V-shaped hunk of glass missing. A last chance, maybe, but she would have to wait to the last second or risk Wither following her out into the safety of the night. Wendy slipped out of her robe and wrapped it several times around her forearm, creating a thick padding. It came as a deafening roar. Wither finally raised her face, lifted her hands above her, reaching for the ceiling, but it was too late. Wendy ran full speed toward the window, choking on the clouds of dust rising around her. She raised her padded arm and dove through the window. She felt it burst out before her, prayed a silver glass wouldn't slice through her throat, and heard the tremendous din behind her, then a sound like a sudden explosion before the consciousness whumped through the window, blowing the remaining shards of glass out into the night. Wendy rolled down the hill on the far side of the ruined building, carried by her momentum into overground bushes. She looked back at the mill and saw that the entire outer wall had followed the collapse of the offices inward, piling tons of bricks and mortar on top of the witch. Minutes later, Frankie found her standing outside the shattered window, staring into the dark interior of the mill as the dust settled. They could make out one long, gnarled black arm protruding from a mountain of rubble. The arm had been severed, crushed paper thin at the shoulder. Black blood spread like crude oil, seeping out from under the stones, collecting motes of dust. Later, they poured gasoline collected from the gremlin's ruptured fuel tank through the window over the pile of stones. When they lit it, another loud whoomp filled the night. The remaining windows flared golden. As Frankie put an arm on her friend's shoulder, Wendy crossed her arms and hugged herself. She looked down and realized her fingernails had begun to return to normal. Epilogue. The fires raged all night. Overwhelmed by the magnitude of the hailstorm's fury, Engine and Ladder Company No. 14 called in fire companies from neighboring townships to fight the multiple blazes burning throughout Wendell. Ipswich's volunteer firefighters converged on the fire that had engulfed Wendell's General Childbirth Wellness Center, while faraway Salem contributed 2 pumper trucks to douse the strange woodland bonfire off Old Winthrop Road. Due to the absence of hydrants so far out of town, the Salem Company was forced to draw water from a nearby creek to fight the raging fire. Meanwhile, Wendell's Company No. 14 concentrated on controlling the blaze threatening the City Hall and several other municipal buildings. That fire, believed to have been started by power lines felled by the apocalyptic hail, was finally brought under control by 2 a.m., but not before it had claimed one municipal casualty, the Historical Society's Witch Museum. To those refugees of the storm huddling in the storefronts and church foyers, the hail had seemed to cease with the stroke of midnight. As the survivors of Halloween of '99 emerged from their temporary shelters and looked up in wonder at the dissipating clouds, they saw restored to the autumnal sky a scattering of twinkling stars. Dawn was still many hours away on this first day of a new month, but already they tasted a difference in the air, like the acrid smoke of an extinguished wick, foretelling of an early winter. At 2:30 in the morning, Wendell General welcomed its second miracle of the season. Though several months premature, Hannah Nicole Glazier weighed nearly 9 pounds at birth and scored a perfect Apgar. Despite her own injuries, physician Maria Labajo assisted at the delivery. The miracle infant, who at one time hadn't been expected to live through her first night, was kept for the first 3 days of her young life in Wendell's General's neonatal unit, where she quickly established herself as the unit's hardiest resident. By her 4th day, she was relocated to a crib adjacent to her mother's room. On Hannah Glazier's 5th day, she welcomed her first visitors. "She's beautiful," Art said from Karen's bedside. He'd come with Abby and the sheriff, who looked uncomfortable on crutches. The little girl clung shyly to the sheriff's aircast. Art slipped an arm around Karen's shoulders. She was surprised to find it felt comfortable there. "She has your eyes," Art said. Karen looked down at the little bundle squirming sweetly in her arms and said, "No, she has her father's eyes." It was true. Hannah's eyes were deep and piercingly blue. Karen could see herself reflected in them as the baby studied her, processing Karen's every expression in puzzled wonderment. She'd been born with a shock of black hair shot through with gray, though the nurses thought this would eventually grow lighter like her mother's. "Do you want to see the baby?" Karen offered Abby. The little girl approached the side of the bed gravely. "It's okay," Karen said. "You can touch her." Abby took the baby's hand in her own and showed a rare smile as Hannah's fingers curled instinctively around her own. The thick, discolored nails of Abby's right hand had fallen off 2 days ago, revealing new growth underneath, the cuticles pink and healthy. The sheriff's wife, Christina, had painted Abby's other fingernails with bright red polish, but this had already begun chipping as Abby played outside with the sheriff's 2 young sons and his 6-year-old daughter, who was already looking at Abby as if she were her older sister. "It's getting crowded in here," Maria Labajo said from the doorway to the private room, her arm in a sling. "Room for one more," Wendy said, entering the room with an autumn-themed bouquet of flowers, which she set down on the table beside. "Thank you, Wendy," Karen said, squeezing her hand briefly. Maria Labajo checked to see that the infection in Karen's arm was responding to the antibiotics she'd prescribed, then that Hannah's umbilical cord stump was healing. She ticked the bottom of one of Hannah's bare feet with her fingertip. The baby kicked vigorously at the air. Wendy smiled broadly at how healthy the baby seemed. "You know," Maria said, "in the Philippines, breech babies are believed to have healing powers." She leaned over the baby and laughed as Hannah rested one splay-fingered hand on her injured arm in the sling. "Oh yes, this one's definitely got the touch," she said approvingly. The baby startled at the unfamiliar sound of laughter around her, just one of the million human responses that lay ahead of her to learn. She was still months away from her first voluntary smile, and so she lay there now among these strange beings and gave them the only expression she'd perfected, rapt fascination. A half hour later, Wendy stood near the nurse's station, waiting there until Alex's parents and his sister, Suzanne, took a break from their vigil to get something to eat in the hospital cafeteria. She had felt far too guilty to introduce herself to them. She entered his room wearing a green jogging suit with a diagonal black stripe across the chest. 4 days ago, she had lugged her exercise bike down to the basement, torn down the wall map of the United States, and traded in her cross trainers for specialized jogging sneakers, which she wore now. Alex looked peaceful. His color had returned, but his face was still mottled with bruises. She took his right hand in hers and said, "Hi, Alex, it's me again, Wendy. You're—" She felt his hand squeeze back, and she gasped. When she looked up at his face, his eyes were open and focused on her. Oh God, am I happy to see you," she said, tears of disbelief streaming down her face. I'll get a nurse, a doctor." "It's okay," he said, smiling. "They know. I regained consciousness this morning. I was dozing." "I'm sorry," she said. "I'll come back later." He held her tight. "No, not yet. I want to look at you for a moment." He glanced at her outfit. "You've taken up jogging?" She nodded. "Doc says I'll need physical therapy. Might even have a slight limp." She smiled, wiped away a tear. "So I'll be able to keep up with you then." He chuckled. "That won't be a problem." "Oh," he said, and reached into the bedside table's drawer. "I have something of yours." He handed her the bundle of cloth. She opened the cloth, revealing the man-shaped mandrake root. When she touched its coarse surface, it crumbled into ash as if the protective charm had been burnt or completely used up. She refolded the cloth carefully, covering the ashes. Alex took her hand again. "You're okay?" I'm fine, she said, then smiled again. Everything's fine now. And that, my friends, is the end of Wither by J.G. Passarella. I hope you enjoyed my reading this Halloween Eve, and to all those who have finished and watched to the end, happy Halloween. So, I'll be doing more readings, not quite this long, from my novel and from others. And you can always join me also on Saturday mornings for my review of D&D products, which I actually have one coming up this morning about the Curse of Strahd. So join me at 10 o'clock this morning for my review of that. And please make sure you hit the subscribe button and the bell for notifications for when I post these videos. And please do make comments in the comment section, because I do so love those, and I'll respond as quick as possible. And share with all your friends so that they can enjoy this content as well. So, until next time, and as always, see you soon.